Good morning and welcome. Thank you very much for joining us for the second session of the day. There are headsets for those who want to have a bit of clearer hearing, but I think you can also hear it in the room. So I'm very pleased to welcome you to our session on built environment market transformation. I'm Roland, I'm the Director for Built Environment at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I'll be moderating this session and give you a short introduction about why we are actually talking about this subject. It will then be my pleasure to have two panels. A first one where we hear from some colleagues on the need for radical collaboration in the built environment. And in the second one, we'll go into some examples of actions that we are all working on and supporting each other. I would like to start with how Yves Laurent this morning left off. And he said, why are we still investing in all these brown buildings? And I didn't know actually. It is part of the Chaillot Declaration. There is a very clear line talking about the issue of transforming from investments into today's building stock into the building stock we need in the future. And in this session, we'd like to focus on what it takes in terms of radical collaboration of companies, stakeholders, all along the value chain for us to achieve that goal. The market transformation work comes out of our collaborative hub that we have at the Global ABC, the Market Transformation Hub, where it was before COP26, we convened a number of stakeholders around online workshops. At that time, we did everything virtual. And we came up with this common narrative on what it means to transform the market. The issue is that the built environment is a very fragmented sector. It is made up of people investing, people building, people producing materials, people designing, and eventually people using those buildings. But there is not sufficient collaboration around a common vision so that we actually transform the way we do things in our daily jobs. So that was the beginning of the market transformation work. We all know the 40% number. Buildings are 40% of global CO2 emissions. If we break that down, a big part is the energy we consume. Of that, again, a big part is the power. Half of global electricity production goes into buildings. And so this is an important part that we need to address from the demand side. How can we reduce that need for that power? And then, of course, how do we produce renewably what we still need? And also for direct on-site combustion, we need to change. We need to get off fossil fuels and electrify. And then the third element is the embodied carbon in the materials, which is maybe a topic now that since 5 years has really come to the fore and is critical, because as buildings get more efficient, that upfront carbon also gets much more important. So the market transformation work is about this graph that you have here in front. We came together and said, well, for the sector to decarbonize, we need to halve emissions by 2030. 14 gigatons today, we need to reach 7 gigatons in 2030, which is a massive task. And then we need to be fully decarbonized by 2050. We can only achieve that if we all have that common vision. And I would say since COP26, we do. So it's been a number of years where we've established collaboratively with the Global ABC, with the Building to COP, with all of us, this common vision. Now, of course, we need to translate what that means. And in a market transformation speak, that means that wherever we sit in the value chain, there's three things that really matter. It's to account for all the emissions in building projects, whole life carbon. It's kind of the currency or the common language that we need to adopt. Now you can break that down. You can say, yeah, there's the embodied carbon, and then there's the operational, and we measure it with energy. Yeah, fine. but we need to look at the total. And then very interestingly, how do we then get that information into our decision making? And we'll hear today about some of the work that's happening. How do we integrate carbon next to cost? Using different tools. It can be carbon pricing, it can be starting to look at benchmarks, etc. How we actually then set that information right next to cost. Because we wouldn't build without knowing the cost, but we still build today without knowing the whole carbon. And then lastly, that third lever is the transformation of the supply and demand dynamics. So how then does that kind of new demand, and back to Yves Laurent's point, the demand that is now not going into brown buildings, but into what we call net zero buildings or future-proof buildings, how does that then translate into contracts along the value chain, into risk sharing, so that these new solutions that can help us get there are really deployed? So it's really a transformation of supply and demand that we need. So I'm almost done because we really want to hear from our panelists. This year then, there was the large event in Paris in March, and we had worked all of last year in several workshops, online and also in person. What does now this market transformation mean in terms of actions that we need to collectively work on? And we've come up with a map of actions. And that is really a map of actions that we need to work on collectively. And you can see those three levers I briefly spoke about, and different actions set against those. And I'm very pleased that we have here today, and also online, people who can speak to some of these actions, because it is really a common narrative, a common agenda, and we can all reinforce our actions by collaborating on this. So with that, it is my great pleasure now to ask on stage my wonderful colleagues, just getting the names and titles right. Scott Tu, Vice President Sustainability at Trane Technologies, if you would join us here up on one of the seats. Alida Saleh, Head of Sustainability for MEA at JLL. With your other hat, part of the Climate Champions team, but today wearing the JLL hat. And Hugh Garnett, he is the Real Assets Lead at the Institutional Investors Group for Climate Change. So I would like to kick us off with just a very short discussion. And yes, I'll give you this one. On very simply, why do you as a company or organization, why do you need this work on the market transformation, this discussion on collaboration? What does it mean for you? But also, what positive signals do you see? And what are key challenges we need to overcome? I'd like to start with you, Scott. You're sitting in the middle, and giving you the mic.
Good morning, everyone. Scott Tu with Trane Technologies. We're one of the world's leading cooling and heating companies. I'm joined by my friends from Daikin International, another one of our large cooling and heating companies. They can keep me honest today. There's some great opportunities. My thanks to World Business Council for the Global ABC. I have to agree with Roland that the last 3 years we've seen some remarkable progress in mapping out the steps that are needed to take advantage of some huge opportunities in the built environment. In particular, Roland mentioned the 40% emissions opportunity. On top of that, though, our own research from our energy service company audits around the world of large commercial buildings, most of the existing buildings today are operating roughly 30% inefficient, meaning that they're not even operating at a level that they were designed to operate at. So two huge opportunities for the world. One is to make buildings that exist more efficient. Another is the opportunity around reducing emissions. And there are several ways to do that. One is it's time that we electrify heating around the world. This is this audience may know about it, but there aren't many people in the world that still understand this potential here. We're still burning fossil fuels to heat ourselves like we did in the cave 10,000 years ago. And we don't have to. It needs to be electrified. As the energy grid transitions, buildings can transition, and the number one factor is to electrify heating around the world. We already have efficient ways to cool buildings. Heating, though, is the great opportunity. On top of that, it's really important that we begin to manage buildings much more sophisticated, a lot more smarter. We have all the technologies to make them operate more smartly, to increase the efficiency, and those technologies are not being fully utilized. And then last but not least, Roland, would be this untapped opportunity around embodied emissions. This is really nascent. This industry has not really worked across the entire value stream. And there are so many opportunities in collaborating with materials providers. I mean, companies like mine depend on a lot of metals, copper, steel, aluminum. And those industries need signals from us to provide better low emission materials for the units that we put in these buildings. Without them, we're not going to decarbonize fast enough. So to get to the 50% by 2030, all of these factors are really important. I see huge opportunities. There are some barriers we can talk about later.
Thank you very much, Scott. And I really like your full life view of your own company. You have put out several years ago your Gigaton Challenge. How do you help your clients to reduce their emissions? And just this year...
Just this year, 2 months ago, we are the first company in the sector to have an embodied emissions commitment, 40% reduction by 2030, and that number we didn't pull out of the air. That was based on a lot of great work by the World Business Council and others who've said that 40% is the number that's needed to help us get to where we should be by 2030.
Perfect, thank you. Really showing how these actions by different companies in the value chain can support each other. Alida, I'd like to turn to you. JLL does a lot of research, and that research interestingly shows a demand-supply gap that I had not expected from certain markets and certain global tenants requiring now much more green buildings instead of brown buildings. Can you share a bit your experience on this? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Alida Saleh, and I'm the head of sustainability for the Middle East and Africa regions. JLL is really committed to decarbonizing the built environment, and we have been working, I would say, tirelessly to work with our occupiers, our landlords, our developers, the value chains to really understand what are the critical gaps in the market. A question that I think, have to really come back to is why are we trying to do all of this? And I think we sometimes lose our bearings when we're talking about the buildings and we talk about, reducing energy and we talk about consumption. We really are doing this because we need to create better places for people where they can thrive and they can really, live their best life. And we have currently a really big gap within the demand and supply, within I would say the market. What we're starting to see at JLL from the report that we published is that there is there's a gap of 30 to 80% in major cities to supply green buildings, which is huge. I wasn't expecting that either, and you can start seeing that. I'll give you sort of different perspectives. When you look at regions such as Europe and North America, you start to see that we have existing stock that's there, and that requires a lot of retrofitting. There are legislations. This is not an emerging market, but when you look at the Middle East and you look at other places, we are in an emerging market situation. What we are starting to see is that, the governments are trying to attract foreign direct investments, and foreign direct investors are now coming with their own criterias of net zero requirements to ensure that their carbon footprints are reduced. So what we're starting to see is that although the demand may not be as high in certain emerging markets, we're starting to see that that is actually changing the market dynamics, because the types of clients or investors that we're trying to bring into the market fundamentally are demanding something that's not existing. And that's a win-win situation if you actually think about it. It's great because we're in the phase of development in the Middle East. So why not start the right way, right from the beginning? So the governments are now starting to build in those legislations, bring in those best practices that are existing from across the world. And it's great for our investors because they don't have to do build to suit. they can actually come in and operate the way they need to and create that. So there's a supply-demand gap even in those emerging markets. What we don't really recognize is that emerging markets are really, really hungry for best practices that are existing. And I don't think anybody has quite figured it out yet, but I think together what the market transformation can do is bring that different voices, different markets, different requirements, whether it's data, technology, legislations, building materials, all together to see how do we harmonize a way to move forward so that we can capitalize on this opportunity, because I don't believe that doing good has to come at a financial cost. I think you can do both. With technologies today, there is definitely an ability to make a lot of money and do good at the same time.
I love the way both of you speak about opportunity and this demand-supply gap being there. I would like in the second round to ask you, well, what's still keeping us back? I don't see that transformation quite happening yet, but I think we're very close. So what will it take? But first of all, you work with an organization that I don't know how many trillions is managed by your members. I let you introduce IIGCC and your take on this discussion.
Thank you, Roland, and apologies for the voice. So,
RTing.
Oh yeah, is that better? Can you hear me now? Fantastic. So yeah, apologies for the voice. It's been a long week and a half already at COP, so slightly losing it. But I work for the Institutional Investors Group on climate change. We are a membership body of institutional investors, have 420 or over 420 members, be those pension funds, insurers, and asset managers, really working on building a net zero and resilient future. I think the key thing for us is that climate risk is financial risk. We heard from Yves Laurent in the session before that the risk, of buildings becoming stranded, that is a real significant risk for us and our economies. Pretty much all of us here will have pensions that are invested heavily within the built environment, and we really need to see those risks managed. And I think another thing I just wanted to add is that investors are really invested throughout this value chain, and we know how complex the value chain is in the built environment. I'm sat here with 2 listed companies. Our members are invested in both of these companies, be it the technology materials companies, be it the providing capital for the development of new buildings, and also the buying and selling of existing buildings and ensuring that those are meeting the demands of the future. And I think linking it back to the MTAA and the market action, market transformation agenda and the 3 levers, I think investors can play a key role in providing signals across these levers, be it the whole life carbon. So investors sitting at the top of the capital stack, if they're requesting that information, then that's going to flow from the rest of the market, and that's absolutely key. And then similarly on carbon cost as well, that's really going to influence the investment decisions that investors are making in the future. And then on that supply demand signal side, investors are absolutely key in showing the rest of the market, demanding the products, demanding the technologies, and providing that broader demand and demand signals to the market.
Thank you very. You hear yourself. Thank you very much, you, for that perspective. And just to that point, earlier this year there was a report published that ruffled a few feathers. It's called The Leaders of the Urban Future, who is a group of some of these leading investors who said it's really difficult for us today to invest in a net zero aligned building or a 1.5 aligned building because the standards and certifications out there don't really give us that. And I think that's it's a really interesting challenge again to all of us. So how do we work together so that those who ultimately provide us with the capital also get that certainty of that investment? But you also said something else that's really interesting, the stranding of assets. Now, I think we can clearly identify that in terms of your flood risk or other risk, that there is a stranding element, but also in terms of your lack of decarbonization. We start seeing some markets now where there is that risk for stranding. But this is very much something that a market needs to develop and where also regulators have a word to say. And in our second panel, we'll speak a little bit to that issue of how do we become much more performance-based as well and really look at that stranding issue with very different lens. So I would just like to ask you one more question for this opening panel. And that's really to those remaining challenges. There is that huge opportunity that we're seeing. We see a market transformation potentially happening. What's still keeping us back, and what do we need to do next? Do you want to start? We go
absolutely.
reverse?
I'm happy to start. So and just picking up on that regulatory piece, Roland, I think that's absolutely key, and both on the real economy side, but also importantly the sustainable finance side. And I think that's a real barrier that we're seeing, and looking to address that. Obviously, we had that LOTUF report, but actually, I think we need to go one step back from that, and we really need to talk to the regulators. For example, in the EU and amongst some of the key sort of sustainability indicators that investors are using, there's 16 definitions of energy use intensity across the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, the Energy Performance of Buildings Declaration, and the EU Taxonomy. 16. So you cannot compare like for like. And that's really challenging, and that impacts on valuations. It provides it's a bottleneck for investment because investors don't know where to allocate their capital, and that's something that we're trying to address. We're trying to address that with some in this room. So IIGCC have convened an informal industry working group really to look to address this, with WBCSD, actually with JLL, both on the consultancy side and the asset management side, and RICS and others in this room, looking to really address these indicators and how can we look to align industry and get definitions across these indicators to get industry to do it. It's not that hard, yet the regulations are so confusing. They're not interoperable. And we really need to address that to get that capital flowing and to really incentivize the movement of capital and action within the industry. And I guess, sorry, just finally, once we can have that industry agreement, then go to the regulators, say this is what industry want and this is how to do it, and the regulators will listen. The investment community is huge, and that's the next step really, is to get the regulators to listen to us and to say this is what we need to really unlock the capital to move towards that mass decarbonisation of existing buildings and also obviously construction of new buildings as well.
Will you be speaking on Wednesday? Otherwise, we should add you, because that's when we have those discussions at the ministerial meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I would echo what Hugh has said, but I will bring it down a little bit to why are our occupiers and investors and them not on this journey. I think we need to understand that we can ask. As occupiers, we should be able to ask and empower our tenants to be able to say, what do I need in order to occupy this building? Because I think the markets are changing. The supply is existing, the demand is great. So if you want me as a grade A, you have a grade A building, but if you want to attract me as a tenant, let me put my things out there and put like green lease clauses out there that says, I would like a net zero building. I need you to have renewable energy. I want to have cost sharing. I think we need to create that environment of collaboration between owners and occupiers. The other things are that we have buildings that are really great, but they're not performed well. So we need performance-based metrics to make sure that it's not just design-based performance, but it's actually performance-based. Because we know behavior has a huge gap. There's a huge gap when you look at the way that the building is designed and the way it's operated. So we need to fill that gap. And then again, I think we need to figure out how we're going to have data transparency. I think data is key to how we're going to unlock some of these opportunities that people can start seeing. Because on a day-to-day basis, I may not be able to understand how my building is operating, how my assets are performing. Am I losing money? Are there opportunities for me to capitalize on these opportunities that are there with low-hanging fruits? And of course, there will be things that will require capital investments. But I always say investment, and I never say cost, because whatever you invest in your buildings today is future-proofing your assets from becoming stranded. It's going to appreciate in value over a period of time. Investors are always looking for signals of change. I think there is no better signal of change than what's happening in COP today. Next year, 5-6 years from today is 2030. what are we going to do today? So investors need to come behind and start accelerating this, because unless they start to see that confidence, but where I see Hughes talking about, investors don't have as much confidence because there is an alphabet soup of regulatory bodies, and I'm hoping that this market transformation is an opportunity for them to see that huge signal of change across like a global platform that can say, okay, collaboratively, big organizations, investors, occupiers, financial institutions are behind this, and it can mobilize a market movement. And I think that's what we need. We need everybody around the table to do this, but it's going to be a lot of hard work, and it's going to be collaboration at a level that perhaps we haven't done before. And so it's going to be a lot of listening, but a lot of negotiating. So I think we ourselves are going to have to become negotiators within this process.
Thank you very much, Alida.
Yeah, a couple of points. Regulation certainly drives the adoption of new technologies, but outside of regulations, we need a price signal on carbon. That's the great global fix for this. That's the accelerator that we all need. I know it's in some circles we can't say that, but it is absolutely true. If we can't have the regulations to drive it, we need a signal that says that there's another reason to do this. That also would drive incentives and investments. Outside of that, though, we need some first mover companies. We need more first mover companies. The Trane Technologies, first company in the HVAC industry to purchase low carbon steel from a supplier. There's no such thing as net zero steel yet. We have some European providers that are getting close, but we're still a few years away from that. However, there's low carbon steel, which means it's made differently, and we're purchasing that. We've already sent out more than 1 million products using low carbon steel. The market has been very open to it. Commercial customers love it. They're actually demanding it now, especially from the tech industry where they care about whole life carbon. It's become a very important driver for their decision making. But we need more first mover companies willing to say, if you can provide a better material for us, then we will purchase it. And that's a really important market signal. It's outside of regulations and it's outside of the lack of a price signal of carbon, but it works. It's a market signal that actually works. Secondly, I would just mention that one of the barriers that we see, we have workforce issues. We can't deploy all of the smart technologies that we have now without more building technologists around the world. We're investing in technical schools to increase the number of building technologists that we put in buildings. The point that was just made about making buildings smarter, yes, we would love to make them smarter so that we can depend less on owner-occupiers of these buildings. Some of it just needs to be automated, and let the smart technologies manage the buildings, its energy use in particular. It also would help the grid be a much smarter grid. And then lastly, we just need some adoption of these technologies. It's still too slow. Any new technology, I guess we're all the same way. Building owners are the same way, very reluctant to adopt something new, whether it's a new automation or whether it's a new way of heating and cooling. They're a bit reluctant to be the first ones to raise their hand to say we want that. And what we found, especially in Europe, is that the building owners want both systems. They want to keep the old one, and they want to put the new one in, which is, it takes a complication. I think we're losing our microphone here. It takes the complication to a higher level. So we're doing more education of building owners. We're trying to find ways to keep the existing and run a new system. So, I think those three things are really, they're barriers, but they're also barriers with solutions.
Yes, please go ahead.
I think we also have to keep in mind, in the emerging markets, Global South, the grid is not a renewable grid. So we have to keep that in mind as we develop these market transformation criterias, because what applies to one part of the world doesn't apply, and we have to be able to unlock that, because most of our buildings are going to be built in Africa. 70% are not there yet. If you look at the Middle East, we're on a growth phase. So I think my call would be, please keep a global perspective on this, because the challenges that are happening sort of in the West or in the East are not always the challenges of the South.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, and I think the grids thing is absolutely crucial, and that's not just that's a whole world issue. And it was great to see the announcement earlier this week on the focus on grids, because in the UK, for example, the time to connect to the grid is astronomical, and it's really slowing down progress, and it's slowing down progress on the tripling renewables goal. So it's great to see the grids piece aligned with that.
I couldn't agree more. And we do see also at WBCSD this issue of grids and long-term storage is really kind of the next barrier. And what I like is just how holistic our conversation is. In this market transformation, we're not only talking about real estate and the actors, but you mentioned steel. There's also, we have colleagues from the concrete sector. Concrete sector is going through a whole transformation as well, and they also need these signals from the market to actually require low carbon specification. And then, as you say, the power. And just making the link back to the buildings breakthrough, where we'll also have a discussion on Wednesday, how does the buildings breakthrough support and is supported by other breakthroughs? Power, steel, cement, they actually also have breakthroughs. So I think I'm very optimistic in this regard, especially listening to you. I think there are market forces that are starting to work. And you mentioned a couple examples that we will actually hear also now in the second panel, the question of performance-based assessment. Nigel will speak about it. The issue of data, I think we'll have two speakers on that. And also this question of the alphabet soup and how do we start standardizing some of these things. And last but not least, we'll talk about the carbon price, Scott, in our second panel. So thank you for teeing us up for this great discussion. Please give a quick shout out for our great panelists. And with that, we'll switch a little bit the rhythm, because we don't want to block the screen, because some of our speakers now have slides. So I will ask you one by one. I'd just like to briefly introduce our wonderful speakers for the second part. Tim Smith, Head of Thought Leadership and Analysis at the RICS, Royal Institute for Chartered Surveyors. Then we squeezed in Ryan Kolker with the ICC, International Code Council. We have Rama Dunajevic, the Global Lead for Sustainability Partnerships at Autodesk. Nigel Tonks, Sustainable Development Director at Arup, also part of the Climate Champions team. And last but not least, we'll be joined online by Alexandra Smith-Kozlowska, who's the Director Research for the Urban Land Institute Europe. So with that, Tim, I'd like to ask you to take my place here, and you have the clicker.
Thank you, Roland. Hello, everyone. Morning. I don't know who else has slides, but I do. So I'm going to talk about whole life carbon assessment alignment. RICS, this is our bread and butter. We created, well, the second edition of our whole life carbon assessment methodology back in last year. Our first edition came out in 2017. It's gone well. People have adopted it, but it's only one standard in an environment of many, many different standards methodologies. So why do we need it? We need consistency so we can actually compare apples with apples. We need alignment because, as I said, there are many different methodologies, and as I said, we need consistency. And ultimately, what gets measured gets managed. And as the panel said before, we actually start need to managing carbon across the built and natural environment, and we're not doing it properly. This is from our sustainability report, which actually comes out on Wednesday. We're actually seeing a lot of progress, which is brilliant. People are actually measuring whole life carbon or embodied carbon now. But also the barriers are that actually there's no consistent standard to do it. So that really points to the fact that we need to actually drive alignment. Progress to date. So we launched at the Buildings and Climate Global Forum in March our harmonisation principles, which was cited by the IEA in the Breakthrough report. And as I said, we also launched our second edition of the standard back in September. We are seeing adoption from both governments and markets. So Infrastructure New South Wales have adopted the standard. and we're also seeing a lot of our members, like Turner and Townsend, using the standard as well, which is also regulated that our ICS members have to use it. What needs to happen next? So I've actually speak to Ryan in New York about this. What we want to do is actually bring people together, organisations, different methodologies, so we can actually have a unified framework for measurement. Actually understand what the basics are that we need to measure, and then actually test, refine, and report. So actually by the end of this time next year, we'll be able to have a framework that we can all use. That's quite a lofty ambition, but my call to action for you guys here and anybody that's listening is come together, like meet us and actually discuss how we can bring this framework together. And great that the panel pointed on this. What we need is policy and regulatory action to drive this as well. The market can do this, but actually we need the environment from a policy and regulatory to actually drive this adoption. So yeah, that's me, Roland. But speak to us, because we need your help.
Thank you very much, Tim. And I heard that in 1 year, COP30, Brazil. We'll ask you to come up again. Then you'll present that. Thank you so much. Please, Ryan, join us here. I'll step back. I'll just go back.
Great. Thanks so much, Roland, and thank you, Tim, for setting the stage on the importance of harmonization and collaboration to address our big challenges. I'm Ryan Kolker, Vice President of Innovation at the International Code Council. We develop model building codes and standards and a lot of the support tools that actually make them effective. So I'm going to touch on sort of three key areas where we need progress. One is certainly on the codes and standards themselves. And ICC, in collaboration with ASHRAE, is developing a quantification standard, ASHRAE ICC Standard 240, to really support the whole life cycle quantification of greenhouse gas emissions. And I've been really pleased to engage and work collectively with RICS to assure that our approaches are well harmonized, and certainly join Tim in the call for all of us to get together to make sure that we do have harmonization in that approach. Second piece I'll touch on is relative to capacity building. We can all develop the greatest codes, standards, tools, and resources, but if they just sit on a shelf and are not used effectively and we don't have the support infrastructure around them to actually make them work, are we actually accomplishing what we've set out to accomplish? And so really, again, working across the sector to assure that we have the resources, the tools, and the capacity to actually make it work. Third piece I'll touch on is relative to data. We've all recognized the importance of having data to actually monitor our progress and assure that we're actually achieving what we've set out to achieve. The challenge that we've seen is a lot of that sort of work, particularly on the data side, has been to solve individual problems within individual disciplines or within individual life cycle stages. And if we're truly looking at sort of buildings as a system of systems and really recognizing the intersection of sort of all of this work, we need a tool to be able to translate data from across the entire spectrum of the built environment, but also recognizing that the built environment doesn't sit in a vacuum. We actually touch so many other economies or sectors of the economy, and so many other sectors of the economy touch us. So thinking about textiles, agriculture, energy, concrete, cement, all of those pieces, we need to be able to have a methodology for bringing that data together. And so earlier this week, we were pleased to collaborate with Standards Australia and UNECE to support a protocol, a universal data protocol for the built environment that intersects and leverages the work on the UN Transparency Protocol to be able to bring all of that cross-economy, sector-based information together. So really pleased to have continued collaboration through the Market Transformation Agenda, Global ABC, and other forums to really help bring these things to reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ryan. The Open Data Protocol. So please look it up. I'm sure it's on the ICC website and on others. So again, another important piece of our puzzle on the transformation. it's now my great pleasure to ask Rama Dunajevic from Autodesk, and you'll talk to us about something that has excited a lot of people from the business side on how we have collaborated.
There we go. I use this, you say? You see it there as well. Oh, okay, great. Oh, thank you. Sorry, you can tell that I'm a different height than Roland. Hi, I'm Rama, and I'm from Autodesk. And it's still to this day, I have to tell everyone what Autodesk is, just in case. We are a 3D design and make software company. So if you think about the buildings that we live and work in, and the cars that we drive, and the roads that we drive on, and even the entertainment that we watch, there's a very good chance that Autodesk customers had a role in designing that. And they trust us to create the tools that they're using to make those creations. And so I actually wanted to speak about this project that we undertook. It took us 2 years. We joined the World Business Council for Sustainable Development about 3 years ago. And we're sussing out the scene. And it took us over 2 years to say, well, we wanted to take action. What was a specific action that we could take that would leverage the membership and outside the membership of the WBCSD to dig into a real world problem. And we came up with the idea of having a proof of concept collaboration around embodied carbon. We said, well, what would happen if 6 AEC companies, mostly AE, not so much C, companies came together and did an embodied carbon assessment of one building. And we would provide that one building, an IP-free building for them to take a look at and go back. And we spent, I would say, about 3 months figuring out what were the parameters, how are we going to decarbonize, what portion of the building were we going to think about, was it going to be the facade, was it going to be the walls, would we talk about the things that were unmodeled, whether that's the rebar within the cement, that's the embodied carbon of the building. And it was a really incredible collaboration between Arup, who you'll hear from next, AECOM, Arcadis, SOM, Rambo, and Foster and Partners. And we're having a whole session on it on Thursday, so you can really hear the deep dive into the work that was done and the agreement that came to. But the realization about radical collaboration and how important it is, and how much transparency existed within this group of, frankly, competitive companies, right, coming together and saying, we're all spending a tremendous amount of time internally at our companies figuring out how to do embodied carbon assessments, and we're wasting a tremendous amount of time. And ultimately, the results that we're coming to are not apple and apple comparisons. So how can we collaborate together, come up with some best practices? What are the insights that we can have? And how can we then hopefully translate what we came up with toward regulation? And so I will. There's a report that's printed. So you can read the report. That's the QR code on the left. And then again, on Thursday, we're having a deep dive session. So you'll really be able to hear the technical considerations that everybody made, how they dug into the embodied carbon, and really, I know it shouldn't be surprising, but how shockingly different the results were measuring the embodied carbon of the same building. And right now, we're thinking about what is the V2 of this project. So if you're interested in participating, we're thinking about how to expand it, both from a depth point of view, whether we're going to, we did mostly walls, maybe we should think about facades, and then also from a, breadth concept and kind of what else can we do to make sure that we're passing on these same key insights and best practices such that we can help change the way that this is being done and bring it together, because there's just simply, as the first speaker was talking about 16 different or the last panel part of it, there's no one way to do this measurement, and it needs to be, and we're wasting a tremendous amount of time, and the collaboration is the only solution to getting this refined and streamlined.
Well, thank you so much, Rama, for shedding a light on this collaboration among companies. I was shocked when you said it took us 2 years. It sounded like, oh, that was a long time. But it's true. It takes time for people to be comfortable to actually work together. But the testimonies we've received are like, wow, why didn't we do this earlier? Because we try to fix the same problem. And so thank you. Thank you for the leadership on this work. Now I'm excited to have Nigel Tonks join us to talk about another collaborative piece that we've brought to COP as well, and particularly to Alida's earlier point about performance-based. Thank you, Nigel.
Yeah, thank you, Roland, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm Nigel Tonks with Arup. We're a firm of global consulting engineers. We're involved with every aspect of the built environment, and it's my pleasure to share with you this collaboration that we have recently published with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. This is an action plan for achieving net zero operational buildings. It's a comprehensive 12-step, clear set of specific steps that create an enabling environment for achieving market transformation to real net zero operational emission buildings in corporate portfolios on an international scale. So this framework was actually born out of the research that we've been doing over a number of years with WBCSD, looking at whole life carbon aspects from embodied carbon through to operational carbon. And in the last report in 2023, which we released last year, we identified there, as you've heard again today, this lack of a globally consistent definition of net zero buildings, substantial variations in net zero standards. We were unable at the time to identify a single national policy requiring buildings to be truly net zero now or in the future, and all of which meant that there are still globally a negligible number of truly net zero buildings. So our research into that paper yielded valuable insight into pioneering policies that were emerging from city administrations and region administrations around the world, and each of which was trying to wrestle and unlock a different aspect of how to enable net zero buildings. And so stepping back from this, we put this together as a comprehensive reading of those different aspects, which when you bring them together, create this cohesive field of all the different aspects that we think are needed to achieve this transformation. Move this slide on. Yeah. This is a slightly busy slide, which you might struggle to read, but if you just focus on the center part of this slide, the framing forms a cluster of 4 principal objectives: definition, transparency, a performance floor, and incentivization. And actually, our first panel set up this conversation beautifully because each of those 4 topics were mentioned by our speakers in the first panel. Under definition, we need to create this internationally consistent definition of net zero buildings, and you've heard from Ryan and from Tim today that there's a big exercise underway to do that, but one which is aligned to the 1.5 degree pathway, one which is underpinned by national decarbonisation pathways in each country. There are citywide examples already developed in countries in Jakarta and Indonesia and in Malaysia, and it requires not just a standard definition, but also a comprehensive assessment methodology. As you've heard from Rama, the inconsistency in the way that we assess whole life carbon now creates this challenge of being able to trust the data and trust the results that we have. And there are methodologies like the Neighbours scheme in Australia, a phenomenal cross-sector collaboration in the UK has just recently released the net zero carbon buildings standard. And then the third aspect of this is, again, as Ryan mentioned, building capability to actually carry out these assessments, to understand, to have the tools and the capability to deliver on these things. The next one is transparency, which is a really powerful driver for change. Mandatory minimum energy carbon emissions disclosures can act as a catalyst for investment, and that's being rolled out in cities like New York and Washington, D.C. and Seattle. And raising awareness, raising public awareness is really important, and things like the Local Law 97 in New York helps to gain an acceptance of minimum energy performance approaches. The third element, of course, is a performance floor. We have to enforce minimum energy performance standards as a driver of widespread change. And in Europe, the Net Zero Energy Building Standard comes into force for public buildings, and that uses, puts public sector investment to kickstart capacity building and to try to change the supply dynamics. And the fourth element, which our panelist from Trane spoke about in the first, was incentivization. Attracting investment in net zero buildings is going to require some form of incentivization. So certifications like Neighbours and Edge Zero Carbon have been shown to drive a value difference in the marketplace. Aligning taxation, aligning investment, aligning funding can, against performance thresholds, net zero performance thresholds, can provide a direct commercial benefit for buildings and will help accelerate the transformation. So bringing it back to the market transformation agenda, this framework directly supports aspects insofar as it calls for this unequivocal net zero goals. It calls for aligning standards for assessment. It addresses mobilizing tenant demand, and it advances the market commitments from the supply and demand chain. Thank you.
Well deserved. Thank you very much, Nigel. And just to say quickly, I will ask after the next presentation all the panelists to come back up. So if you have questions, there will be an opportunity, of course, to discuss. But before we do that, I would like to ask our online speaker if she can hear us, Alex Smith-Kozlowska from the Urban Land Institute. Do you hear me?
Hi, Roland, and hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Yeah, thank you very much for being with us. It's early for you. You're in London, if I understand. And we're very excited to hear about, now we can see you as well. Wonderful.
Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, and we're really interested to hear about the carbon pricing work. Over to you. Thank you.
Very much. I just can't see the slides that are being presented.
Just a moment. I think they're being put up. Yeah. So
perfect.
You just have to tell me when I should click.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, I'm delighted to be able to join you virtually today. So thank you for having me. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the work we've been doing on basically counting the cost of inaction. So, you know, what is the cost of doing nothing? I think we've been talking a lot about how much it costs to decarbonize our industry, but doing nothing also will come with a cost. And we've been looking at transition risk and how to quantify it and incorporate it in property valuations, but also more recently we've been looking at carbon pricing, and this is the focus for today. So if you could move to the next slide, just a little bit of background. Because carbon pricing sometimes can come across as a very dry and boring topic, and hopefully in the next few minutes I'll be able to change your mind if you ever thought so. But it's based on the polluter pays principle. So it's a well-established principle, which basically means that whoever produces pollution should be financially responsible for mitigating the damage done by this pollution. And the concept of carbon pricing has been rising really quickly on the global agenda. So at the moment, A quarter of global carbon emissions are covered by carbon pricing mechanisms, whether it's taxation or emissions trading scheme. And this is up from only 5% in 2010. So it's been really, really picking up pace. Now, we all know that the built environment is responsible for nearly 40% of global emissions. So unfortunately, we are one of the largest polluters, but there is no industry-wide carbon pricing mechanism, which, you know, I find quite surprising. Our ULI survey that we did a couple of years ago showed that only 12% of real estate companies have a voluntary internal carbon price. So there is a big gap between the carbon emissions that we produce and the price we pay for that. And closing this gap is becoming an increasingly important issue for our industry. And it is an issue because carbon has a cost. It's not made up. Managing the impacts of climate change on society, on our assets, on infrastructure, all of that costs money. And at the moment, it's just someone else who's paying it. And as an industry, we need to take responsibility. We need to hold ourselves accountable. First of all, it is the right thing to do. We need to do that. But also, if we don't do that ourselves, someone will make us. So on the next slides, you can see just some recent headlines from news outlets and newspapers that show that, first of all, the society is demanding action. People are protesting highly carbon emitting companies. People are taking companies to courts. There's an increasing number of court cases, but also people are suing governments for lack of action. And then the governments are feeling that pressure as well. So there's legislation coming. So Nigel just mentioned the local law 97 in New York City. In Europe, you know, potentially the ETS2 will cover buildings. We've got the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which will cover some construction materials. So again, if as an industry we don't move the needle, someone will be pushing us soon anyway. But then we might get less of a say of how that looks. So on the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit more about why we think that carbon pricing is the right tool to accelerate change and to really scale up decarbonization in the built environment. So first of all, we've seen that it works in other industries. So the emissions that are covered by carbon pricing mechanisms right now decreased by 40% in the past 8 years. So we have seen that emissions that are covered by carbon pricing are reduced at a much higher pace than other emissions. So we have seen in other industries that this works. Carbon pricing helps us mitigate risk. It helps us prepare for any upcoming costs, for all that stakeholder pressure that we're feeling. It incentivizes innovation. So if it costs more to emit carbon, there's more of an incentive to think differently about conducting business. Also, it helps raise funds for decarbonization. So you know, with taxation, sometimes that funds just kind of leave your organization and maybe go somewhere else. But at the moment, if we adopt an internal carbon price, if you do that as an organization, you can just raise funds internally to channel capital to decarbonize assets that really need it, or to justify maybe some initiatives that under the normal scenario wouldn't be financially viable, and it would be a bit harder to justify. And then, of course, it demonstrates leadership. If a company is one of the first kind of mover in this space, it just shows that they are a responsible business. And one thing that came up through our research that I found personally quite surprising was that carbon pricing actually really supported culture change in organizations. So translating carbon emissions into finance really spoke to non-sustainability teams. And it really helped embed thinking about carbon throughout different teams in organizations. And we've seen that lead to business model transformation. And we're talking about, you know, needing that transformation to happen, we can't conduct business as usual anymore. And it's a great tool to support culture change. So this is why we're looking at it. This is why it works, but it is complicated, and we appreciate that. We admit that it's not just as easy as everybody tomorrow waking up to a new carbon price and just doing it. I think we've mentioned before today that we are a fragmented industry. We are very complicated. There are a lot of players involved, and this is why accountability is tricky. We maybe just got our heads around scope 1, 2, and 3 and taking responsibility for that and for reporting. But when it comes to actually paying the price for carbon, it requires a little bit more conversation and understanding who is responsible for what. So it can get really, really complex. Then we, at the moment, don't have common standards or methodology or frameworks on carbon pricing. Sometimes it can make investors a little bit skeptical if there's no widely recognized methodology or one consistent carbon price, and policy is inconsistent. So we've got some local carbon pricing and in some places, but in other places there's nothing in place. So for global companies that operate in lots of diverse geographies, again, it can get a little bit complicated to implement an internal carbon price. We also know it can be a tough time for many real estate companies at the moment. There are a lot of competing economic priorities, and the take-up and awareness is quite low. We're trying to change this. This is why we're working in this space. But ultimately, we would love to see the industry coming together and really pushing for it together. And we think that now is a great time because it's an emerging topic, and we have a chance to shape it and to really have a say in what it looks like. So just on my last slide, I wanted to show you 2 reports that we've published. And we've collaborated with the industry and other industry organizations on this. This is too big a topic for just one organization to tackle. And also we've had endorsements from other industry organizations. So one report is called Accelerating Accountability, the Case for Carbon Pricing, where we explain why we think it can work. And why it can be beneficial. And it also has lots of case studies of companies that actually did it to show that it can work in practice. And we published universal principles for carbon pricing in the real estate sector. And this sets out 7 principles for any real estate organization. They are voluntary, and they are meant to be a very first step for companies that are thinking about starting their carbon pricing journey. And that wouldn't have been possible with the industry-wide collaboration, just because we are this complex and this fragmented. So I would encourage all of you to have a look, have a think about whether you could apply an internal carbon price in your organization while we wait for the policy to move. And I think that's it from me. So thank you very much, Roland.
And a really important topic as well for our audience. So if you're able to stay, please do. I'm now asking the panelists of the second panel, we can't bring you all, but at least from the second panel, if you could please come up, maybe just leave the one chair in front of the screen, and just take the others. And I'd really like to open it to the people here. If you have any questions, I would also like to encourage you yourselves, if you have questions to others that have presented. We'd like to take a moment for that.
I can start, Roland.
Yes, please do.
So Tim and I both represent standards developers and sort of providers of tools that sort of unlock the opportunity for folks within the design and AEC community. What more do we need to be doing to address your particular needs?
You can pass to the next.
Uh-oh, looks like the challenge is on.
I think it's a really well, it's a good question. So, I mean, the proof of concept work that Rama presented, I think. But, oh, I see. The proof is that better? Concept work Rama presented really interesting because what that has shown is that even following a very clear standard assessment methodology like the RICS version 2 standard methodology, consultants in practice have to use a lot of their own judgment in how they evaluate quantities and carbon emission factors for buildings. So the standards that we need, that you're working on, that RICS has developed for a while, those are absolutely essential. But I think it's important to realize that that is like a master framework, a very high-level framework that gets the industry moving in the same direction. But then the work that they do actually has a huge amount of granularity, which our work has shown can lead to inconsistency in the results and the way the carbon is measured. So I think your work is so important. I know you're collaborating with industry. I know we're working with you, Ryan, and we're working with you, Tim. I think it's just to be conscious of what the next layer is. We've got to go one step at a time. But I would say it's being conscious of what the next layer of consistency is that we could bring into standards.
I think that's exactly right. And I mean, you'll see in the presentation on Thursday, I'm trying to remember whose slide it is, but there's this incredible slide of here's the assessments we made internally, and here's the steps we had to take to make it match with RICS. That's not a criticism of RICS or a criticism of what's coming out of Revit, but making that matching was so complicated and created its layers and layers of work. So I would say, if I had to think about it, I think one, more transparent collaboration, because what we output from our software has, or any, not to make it all about Autodesk, there's plenty of other providers, but what gets output from the model and then put into the regulations has to be more clear, because it ends up every company spends way too many cycles. It's good to have their own IP where they're having input, but also they want to be able to compare an apples and apples. So it can't be that companies like Arup, who are doing that extra work, are essentially getting punished for saying, okay, this is our building's net zero, or our building isn't net zero because they've done that analysis. And a company that's not doing that analysis is like, oh, our building's net zero, and they haven't done any of the measurement, and certainly not the careful measurement. So I would say, to your question, which is an excellent one, is how can we simplify it? How can we make it more transparent? And how can we make an easier translation from the technology in which things are being designed into the technology, into the regulatory framework of which it's being measured?
If I may sort of follow up and back to everyone, so as we start to standardize, we start to put clearer definitions in, we start to explain precisely what people should be measuring and where and how they should be relating that data. Then there's this whole extra layer of granularity, which is where you're trying to get that information out of designs or out of a real world building and translate it into that framework. So one thing I think we're really interested in, all of that is a huge amount of effort. That's a big resource demand, and that is a barrier right now to people voluntarily doing whole life carbon commitments, because to actually undertake an accurate calculation is a big effort. So as we start to appreciate all this complexity and get it lined up and get the standards lined up, we've still got a lot of work to do. And so automation is a really important part of this. So I'm interested, Ryan, if you could just talk a little bit more about the data harmonization work that you were doing, because that sounds really interesting to me, because that is a really important part of being able to, speed up extracting data, extracting quantities, accessing carbon factors, doing a pretty simple calculation to multiply one by the other, and then spit that out within a standard.
Yeah, so really appreciate that. And, both ICC and Standards Australia, sort of work across the sector and really recognize the great work that's happening. But as you mentioned, sort of those various different data silos, data sources, and if we're really truly getting to a whole life cycle approach, we really need that mechanism to be able to transfer data effectively across sort of different platforms, different use cases, and ultimately sort of it sits at the desk of an ESG professional or someone to sort of roll all that up. And so the Universal Data Protocol is really intended to sort of be that translation tool. So, not a repository of data or, sort of anything like that, but really sort of provide that basis of, if you're using Revit or if you're using a facilities management tool, you're able to sort of pull together the data from those particular systems in a way that, it makes sense for that facility manager to understand sort of, what's actually in the design and which data is valuable to me as a facility manager and which data do I need to pass on to sort of the next user sort of across that life cycle. And so leveraging automation and technology to be able to sort of bring those data pieces together is really where we're focused. I think initially sort of starting at the product level, but understanding that, sort of products become systems, become buildings. And so, being able to sort of bring all of those pieces together. And then really recognizing that buildings sit within, portfolios and, sort of corporate reporting, scope 1, 2, and 3. And so how do you then bring that into sort of the broader picture of what's going on at a corporate level and then ultimately sort of at an economy-wide level?
So much. I love discussions among panelists, and you don't need a moderator anymore, which is, I think, what should happen. May I, though, move to one question from the audience?
Yes.
I'd really like to include them. Please
Hello.
go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Guy Tansiu from the International Union of Architects. I have a question for you. Thank you a lot for all the progress that has been done in the past year. I can see a lot of progress. My question is lack of standards, lack of regulations, lack of framework. How do you harmonize all this with half of the world that has a different type of climate, tropical climates, Africa, Asia, etc.? Thank you.
Yeah, I can certainly start. So ICC develops model building codes and standards and a lot of the tools that sort of make them work. I think the key word there is model. So it sort of sets that framework for what are the things that you need to be thinking about as you input codes, regulations, and sort of making that work effectively. And so really the challenge then is how do you take sort of that high level sort of principles and things to think about and right size that for the particular country or jurisdiction, that's adopting them. And so figuring out sort of where are they in the regulatory spectrum, sort of what products, services, standards do they currently have in place, and how does that integrate well together into sort of a broad system. And then really assuring that you have the capacity building in place that, that system works effectively, in that jurisdiction, in that country. And so being able to sort of pull all of those pieces together. And so I think that's really sort of the crux of it, is figuring out sort of how to translate sort of principles and frameworks into things that actually work on the ground.
Just building on from that, I mean, it's the same with the RICS standard. It's principles, and it should operate in the context that it's being used in. And I think that's the key thing, especially with the harmonisation document. It's 7 key principles that can be adopted or used, with local construction practices, local regulations, local jurisdictions. Also the climate factor, the carbon factors, the climate factors that actually need to be built in. That's what it's designed to do, and hopefully the work that we can do, that I invited people to participate in. I do think there's a point here where we look at this with a Western lens and actually not from a developing world lens. And actually that's one thing that we need to bring in with the discussion as we build it out, which is actually what the difference is that we need to actually bring into consideration when we're developing this framework.
I don't know if our panelist who's listening online wanted to say anything.
Alex, just in case, do just shout out if you want to intervene. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Well, just very quickly, I agree with everything that you said, and I think that it's really important to make the principles kind of easy to follow, but flexible enough to apply to different contexts. And I think that people on the ground will know much better than us how to apply them. And I think the education piece sometimes maybe is underestimated, but really, really important. And, on a building level, for example, how do we speak to facilities managers who actually operate the building on a day-to-day basis? And how do we explain how all those high-level global principles apply to their day-to-day job? Not just thinking about the different climates, but the actual people in the actual building who work with it day in, day out. That's really important.
And I think also acknowledging the different incentives, right? So the designer of the building has a different a thought process for how they're designing the building and what they're expecting from it, as opposed to the person who's operating the building, as opposed to the real estate owner who owns the building. And so I think, to your question about kind of working together more, it's one, I think there need to be fewer separate regulations and more conversation amongst the different regulatory databases, so that they're more closely related, and not making a competitive advantage that anybody has. We have a new way of doing this, and then somebody else is like, oh, we have a new way of doing this, because it just creates too much complexity. And I really do think that kind of understanding the different incentives that people are operating under affects the way that they're reporting and what the information that they need. And I think we need to have a better understanding of the ecosystem of it, and such that we can streamline.
I have two more questions. I first have the lady, and then afterwards the gentleman.
Thank you very much, panelists. This has been a very illuminating session. Usha Ranigam, Professor, Sustainable Built Environment at RMIT University in Australia. So I'm well aware of the neighbour scheme and the importance of the feedback loops from the design perspective. So we've got a number of different actors that are involved in the value chain. So even in a case like Australia, where we've had neighbours for such a long period of time, I don't believe we're at the cutting edge of design and facility management and operations. So those feedback loops are not really working. So let alone in looking at scope 3 emissions or looking at embodied carbon. So I was just wondering whether the panelists have any comment to make about the role of both professional development in this space, but also basic education for graduates that are coming out of universities. Thank you.
I can maybe start with the sort of professional education for folks coming out, and Nigel, you can correct me as a design professional. The codes and standards and regulatory curriculum within the A&E sort of accreditation or learning process is almost non-existent. It's something that you then learn once you get to practice on, sort of what does that actually mean for what I'm designing. And so I think there's opportunities to sort of bring in that regulatory piece and that conversation of, sort of how are you actually developing buildings and how are you actually delivering buildings in sort of that context of sort of codes and standards. And I think then that also leads to sort of opportunities for design professionals to actually be involved in the codes and standards development process itself. So providing those feedback loops of, what is actually working, how do we actually do it better, and how do we actually continue to improve?
Yeah, for an RICS perspective, we've got 145,000 members globally. Our standard, the Whole Life Carbon Assessment Standard, is mandated that if you are an RICS member, and we regulate our members, that you will be using that. In the development of our standards, we consult with our members, but not just our members, with other professionals in adjacent professions in the built environment. I think the thing that we see is that ongoing professional development and actually making sure that we provide training, CPD, that is relevant to the field of work that they work in. And I think part of it is how do we get the feedback loop from them to update the standard as a more iterative process, which is actually making sure it's relevant for the context that they're working in on a day-to-day basis. That's something I think we are seeing. We're getting feedback all the time on actually, to your point, this doesn't work actually in practice. How do we refine that? And it's 250 pages long, so it takes a while to update that. But I think just having that feedback loop, and not just from our professionals, actually from all professionals, to your point, Rama, we only can update and make the process better if we have that feedback loop, how it's working, how it isn't working, etc.
If I could jump in really quickly. So I think that we've got an issue with lack of skills. We need a lot of upskilling in terms of carbon. And we keep talking about treating carbon data on par with financial data, but if you look at the size of, let's say, the financial teams and cost consultants and quantity surveyors versus teams that look at carbon, there's a big gap. And maybe we can meet somewhere in the middle. I think that maybe we need to simplify certain things, but also we need to upskill. But in terms of engaging non-sustainability teams, I just wanted to reiterate from the case studies that we included in our latest reports, translating carbon into monetary terms really helped people understand what we're trying to do. I felt like it did more than a lot of different courses on sustainability and decarbonization, just because everybody does the language everybody understands. Everybody operates in kind of that sphere. Everybody understands the financial terms. And that really helped engage the teams and really make them understand that they need to maybe think differently or find different solutions. So that could be also one way of bridging that gap between different teams.
I just wanted to say, I think it's an absolutely fantastic question. If I sort of draw on some of my experiences, there's the technological and standardization challenge of how you standardize an approach and how you have the right kind of technology and tools, digital tools, to help you deal with this. But then you've got the human factor. So in our organization, we have offices in 90 different cities. 7,000 people have had to be trained to try and understand this. This is an incredibly fast-moving, emerging picture. And so, I think it's really important for education to get hold of it, but it's moving so fast. We're moving. I think the practitioners and industry are doing a lot of development, research, really at the cutting edge of doing this. And even in our organization, we had over 150 different methodologies across those 90 offices. So we've only been doing this for 10 years, and yet everybody's sort of cooking up ways to, tools and different spreadsheet methodologies and different techniques. And that organic pioneering approach has led to a situation where there's already inconsistency. I think Tim was alluding to that with his, with the RICS members. You've got to train your own people in this emerging capability. So I think universities and schools can play a huge role in this, but we've somehow got to, share with you what the industry is doing at this kind of leading edge, so that you can put that into the students. What I do see from students, from people emerging from, is a really keen appetite. They are some of our sharpest advocates for this. We have some of our youngest members sitting in front of some of our most senior experienced clients, explaining to them what whole life carbon is and why it's important. And so that's, it's a great opportunity for young people to take a leading role in industry.
And not to give a total plug to Autodesk, but it is why our software is free to all students in all countries, all our software and not light versions. Because as students are coming up and learning and it's changing, I mean, even within our proof of concept, one company, there was one company who had 2 different offices working on this proof of concept. And they didn't even know internally that they were doing embodied carbon assessment differently in the two offices because one was in one country and one was in another country. And it only came out of working on this proof of concept that they're like, oh, so we have actually 7 results from 6 companies because one company had 2 different methodologies entirely. And it was an amazing outcome of that. So I think you're exactly right. I mean, it's moving quickly. It's transforming, and not to put that much pressure on the up and coming students because I think we keep thinking they're going to save the world after our actions. But I think one of the things that's so exciting is that it is now a focus, that it is part of it, and having that training will make it such that this conversation and this level of transparency will make it easier. I hope, I'm optimistic as we move forward.
Thank you very much. Great question and great conversation. That's good. We have time for just 2 more questions. If I may ask you to give maybe short answers. Yeah? No. It's just that I would like to release you on time. We have time, but I'd like to release you as well at some point. Please go ahead.
This is Timurhan Timur. I'm a structural engineer and also dealing with digital transformation and services, leading that in Arup, Turkey. So hearing about discussions about global data standards, which is, I think, really crucial in getting all this done in a proper way. For the, say, 3D modeling or like the Autodesk products are doing, they are being used widely in the world. So maybe having some really standards in 3D modeling based on some, say, data from Autodesk may be easy to do. But going into the structural engineering part, like the designer's part, there are lots of different tools, software packages in each country. And I think it is really difficult to engage with all of them. So it should be agnostic, like software agnostic, platform agnostic, etc., including Autodesk. But how do you see this as a challenge, and how is your plan to tackle this, having an agnostic data, say, protocol?
Yeah, I can certainly start with that. And we definitely recognize that there are tools that work for individual disciplines, and we don't want to replace those. The opportunity is actually leveraging those and amplifying their ability to deliver data. And so it's really about sort of figuring out what outputs are actually available from those software tools and being able to sort of set the protocol for how that data is then sort of translated into something that means something to another software tool. And so, designers continue to design in whatever software tool they're using. Facility managers continue to use the building management system they continue to use. It's about being able to sort of take the outputs and translate them into something that the next stage in the life cycle can actually use.
I think that's incredibly important because you're right, there are so many different proprietary systems now, and each of those software providers are sort of expanding their range to try to incorporate all the emerging needs in this calculation space, and they're doing it in different ways, but their inputs and their outputs are different. And one of the challenges there is how do you aggregate the data from all these different tools? And if we want to be able to draw insights and not design one building at a time, we need to be able to, compare large data sources. And so that comparability is incredibly important. And it is a challenge at the moment because the industry is competing with each other to provide these tools. And they're not collaborating or talking with each other and sort of showing you what's under the hood. You put your numbers in, you get some numbers out, and it's very difficult. So that's the kind of collaboration that we need if we're going to get some alignment. All the tools can be different, but somehow the data in and the data out needs to be comparable, and that is something we've got to work towards.
Thank you for that. Excellent. And we have one last question, Rodrigo.
Guys, thank you for this. So I'm Rodrigo from Bentley Systems. So I'm Director of Sustainability from the department that is Sustainability and Education, which kind of solve some of the answer some of the problems that you raised here. We try to bring them together exactly because of what we see as the gap of talent in terms of decarbonizing and resilient infrastructure. But I have 2 or 3 points here. So open data ecosystems. This is really the vision that we are trying to bring, because we are trying to deal with infrastructure, which is even more system of systems. So we have dealt with projects in the UK, like HS2, where we see, Network Rail, for instance. They try to, they have one station with one software. One solution might be for Autodesk, then they might have a solution from Bentley, then they might have a solution from the Dassault Systèmes, and they want to compare, right? So they face this problem. So we try to open this with a platform that is based on open source, and it's available. So we try to aggregate data from multiple vendors, and it's open source. It's there. You can see we have been building for more than 11 years models for different types of infrastructure, exactly to help the community contributing to it. It's really there, right? So we're trying to build this ecosystem there, because it's for infrastructure, at least I think it's completely critical, even for our business, to grow our business, right? It's not possible to survive on that. Then the other question I have is, it's not a question, but I would say a concern, and something I think we need to work on that. We are discussing here embodied carbon accounting. At the end of the day, what makes the difference, it's not, well, we need to measure to manage, right? But after measuring, we need to manage. And to manage, we need to reduce. To reduce, we need to get insights from data. So if you have 10 calculators, or 20, or 5, you might have different results. We need to find a way to have also a standard way of providing results of carbon, like an open API that is available that with a common format, so that you can have one-click LCA, EC3, Circulus, whatever, all them throwing results on an open standard, so that Autodesk, Bentley, Trimble, whatever, can get that data and then generate insights with the best user experience, and then we will compete. But with the best user experience. But if we don't have standards, we have to select 1 or 2, because we cannot develop 10 integrations, right? It's not practical for us, and it's going to be a difficulty to provide solutions to Arup and others. So just to provide this information here.
Yeah, so I'll start with that, and I'll pass it to Tim, who probably has something to say as well. ASHRAE ICC Standard 240 is really intended to be that common quantification of how do you sort of take the entire life cycle and have sort of that methodology on reporting greenhouse gas emissions related to that. And then, sort of assuring it's not competing with existing standards like the RICS standards that, sort of, as Tim mentioned, sort of engages a certain, sort of segment of the market, and making sure that all of those sort of pieces are aligned so that tools can develop around them.
Yeah, they completely agree with that, Ryan. And just one example, in the UK, you've got the Built Environment Carbon Database and the newly launched UK Net Zero Building Standard, which actually points to reporting into the Built Environment Carbon Database. So actually, you will have that comparable, that clear transparency around the data that's being inputted. And it uses the whole life carbon assessment methodology as the way of measuring that carbon. So yes, it's another tool, but actually it's a clear, transparent way of actually showing an ecosystem that's all linked up.
Thank you very much for these questions and discussion. I hope we haven't lost those who are not geeks of whole life carbon and data, but it is an important subject. And we come back to this issue of standardization. How much can we standardize? I'm not going to ask you this question now for next year. What is it we're actually going to see? But I would like to just come to a close and really thank you all for being here, and especially our esteemed panelists. Can I maybe ask you one last question that you didn't expect? Just because we're here at COP, and several of the topics you've brought up, capacity building, standardization, is also in the Buildings Breakthrough. That is being discussed across 5 priority actions. They're meeting on Wednesday. What would be your message or ask to the buildings breakthrough on these topics? So what would you need from the governments who participate in this process? Do you want to start, Ryan, because you have the mic?
Sure, I can start, and we're certainly pleased to be heavily involved in the priority action areas of the Buildings Breakthrough, leading priority action area 5 around capacity building, and then heavily engaged in priority action 1 around sort of standards, certification tools, and sort of how do we actually harmonize in that space. I think the biggest thing is actually hearing from folks that are sort of working in those areas of what do you actually need to be effective. And I think particularly in the capacity building space, there's opportunities across the entire value chain. So what are those things that you need to actually implement to make them practical?
I think it's around that definitions and standardization. I think that's as I said, we're seeing through our analysis and our data that the thing that will drive adoption is policy and regulatory change, and that's what we would ask them for, but quicker. Yeah.
It's a really good question. So answering this from a kind of private sector basis, rather than my other hat with the Climate Champions, working with colleagues here who are involved with the different work streams of the Building Breakthrough. I wonder whether the Building Breakthrough could position itself more with industry and be this call for collaboration, the kind of trust frameworks that were established by WBCSD and Autodesk to do this proof of concept model. It needs a call from outside. Private sector can be brought together by organizations like yours, by instruments like the Building Breakthrough, and I think there's a tremendous amount in it, particularly on standard solutions, that private sector would like to contribute to, because they've got solutions that they would like to get in there, but they would learn from the solutions that are being gathered. So I think it's finding some way to draw in industry into the Building Breakthrough field of activity in a way that is actually tangible for private sector.
You, Rama? And
I don't know that
Alex
I have a great answer, but I would say clarity, right? So I think even over the course of today, the number of times I've heard people say net zero building, yet there is no definition of what is a net zero building. So what I would look to is more clarity on the definitions, such that the private sector and the public sector can then move to that. But if everybody's kind of running to a different target, we're not going to get there. So, to the point that Rodrigo made about, about having some kind of clarity of where we're going and being able to compare apples and apples. And I think that that's where the Buildings Breakthrough could make a huge difference, is if they could set a definition, then we'd have a target we could all shoot towards, because you can't measure, you can't manage what you don't measure.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. And Alex, we're happy to relay your message from further away.
Thank you. Yeah, for me, we've been talking about collaboration, and collaboration within the industry is great, but also I would love to see the regulators creating policy very much in collaboration with the industry. At the moment, the regulatory burden is taking up a lot of time and resource that could be dedicated to action. So we just need to work together to make sure that policy works. That it's not just taking up the precious resource in terms of reporting, but actually drives action. And in terms of carbon pricing, I would love to see some policy that's easy and simple to be applied on a more international level, because a lot of companies have global portfolios. But also, I would love collaboration between regulators and the industry on how to spend the funds raised by any carbon taxation, and for the industry to have a say in where that capital is needed most.
Thank you very much. A clear call for further collaboration between the industry and the government side. I think that's definitely, when we started the market transformation work, was a key objective, that It's really a narrative. It shows us how actions by different stakeholders reinforce each other. We've put quite a spotlight here on the standardization, the data thing, but I think really this alignment with the buildings breakthrough is something that's very important to us as well as we continue driving the market transformation work. Thank you very much for being with us. Have a look at the schedule for further events here in the Buildings Pavilion. We have quite a number still going on this week, so look forward to see you this week. Thank you very much.